France spent a decade and roughly $1 billion on a fortress the German army crossed in a single day in 1940. They did not storm it, they simply drove around it, through a forest every French planner had called impassable. This is the Maginot Line in the Battle of France, 1940, the greatest defensive work ever built, and the doctrine that doomed it. To understand the failure, we must first understand what France had actually built, and why it looked so rational on paper. After the First World War, France had lost more than 1.4 million dead, a demographic wound that shaped every decision for 2 decades. France could not afford another war of attrition, so its generals built a wall to make the next war someone else's problem. Construction began in 1929, named after the Minister of War André Maginot, who pushed it through the French Parliament. The plan was staggering, a chain of fortresses stretching roughly 450 kilometers along the German and Italian borders. The heaviest fortresses were called ouvrages, and each one was a self-contained underground city buried beneath the earth. Deep inside, crews lived in barracks, ate in mess halls, and worked in hospitals and power stations far below the surface. A narrow-gauge railway ran through the tunnels, moving ammunition and supplies from one end of the line to the other. Above ground, retractable steel turrets could raise heavy artillery, fire, and then vanish back beneath the concrete. The concrete was up to 3.5 meters thick in places, designed to shrug off the heaviest shells of the era. By any measure of engineering, the Maginot Line was formidable, perhaps the strongest fixed fortification ever constructed. But the line was never meant to be a complete wall. It had a deliberate gap at its northern end, a choice that would decide everything. That gap was the Ardennes, a dense forest on the Belgian border that French doctrine had long declared impassable for tanks. The French High Command believed the Ardennes was nature's own fortress, so they left it defended by only a handful of light divisions. To grasp why the Ardennes was left so weakly held, we have to understand French doctrine after the First World War. The French army had been bled white in the trenches, and its leaders were determined never to fight that way again. So they built for defense, betting that a belt of concrete could force a future enemy to blade against it. Crucially, the line was never intended to stop a German attack along its entire length. Instead, it was a funnel designed to channel any German advance into Belgium, where the Allies would meet it head-on. The French and British plan, called the Dial Plan, would send their best armies racing into Belgium the moment Germany invaded. That gamble assumed the Germans would come the same way they had in 1914, through the open plains of Belgium. The Ardennes, by contrast, was a tangle of narrow roads, steep ridges, and thick forest that tanks could not possibly cross. This was the core French assumption, and it was shared by nearly every general in Europe at the time. But across the Rhine, a new generation of German officers was reading the same maps and reaching a very different conclusion. They understood that a forest is only impassable if the enemy believes it is, and that the French had committed their best troops elsewhere. Among these officers was a bold strategist named Erich von Manstein, who would reshape the entire German plan of attack. Manstein argued that the main thrust should strike not through Belgium, but through the supposedly impassable Ardennes itself. His superiors resisted at first, and the plan was nearly shelved more than once during the winter of 1939 and 1940. But a stroke of luck intervened in January 1940, when a German plane carrying an earlier invasion plan crashed in Belgium. The documents, which fell into Allied hands, revealed the original plan and forced the Germans to change it completely. The crash forced a fundamental rethink, and Manstein's bold plan suddenly became the heart of the German offensive. The final plan, code-named Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, shifted the main armored thrust squarely toward the Ardennes. 7 armored divisions were massed in the center, poised to pour through the forest the French had dismissed. Behind them stretched an enormous traffic jam of supply vehicles, stretching back for miles along the German roads. The French had placed their best armies far north in Belgium, leaving the Ardennes sector defended by second-rate units. Those units were mostly reserve divisions, older men with older equipment, stretched thin across the forest line. On the 10th of May, 1940, the German offensive opened simultaneously against Holland, Belgium, and France. As the Allies rushed north into Belgium to meet the expected attack, the trap was already closing behind them. The decisive strike came on the 13th of May, when German tanks burst out of the Ardennes onto the Meuse River. At a bend in the river near the town of Sedan, the German armor found a weakly defended crossing point. Within a single day, German infantry and engineers forced the crossing, punching a hole in the French line. The breach at Sedan was the moment the entire French strategy collapsed, turning the war into a race to the sea. German columns now raced west toward the coast, aiming to cut off the entire Allied army trapped in Belgium. Meanwhile, the mighty Maginot Line forts sat silent and unengaged, their guns never firing at the main enemy force. The Germans simply bypassed the entire line, driving around its southern end after the main Allied armies had been cut off. By late May, the entire Allied field army was trapped in a shrinking pocket along the coast of the English Channel. By the 26th of May, the trapped Allied armies had only one escape route left, the small port of Dunkirk. The evacuation, code-named Operation Dynamo, was never supposed to save more than a fraction of the force. British planners estimated they might rescue perhaps 45,000 men before the pocket collapsed. In the end, nearly 340,000 soldiers were brought home across 9 frantic days. A remarkable armada of destroyers, ferries, and civilian pleasure boats answered the call from across the Channel. Yet Dunkirk was a defeat disguised as a miracle, for the entire British expeditionary force had abandoned its equipment. Tens of thousands of vehicles and most of the army's heavy guns were left rusting on the sand. To the south, the French armies still fighting were now cut off from their allies and from any hope of reinforcement. With the north lost, the German armor wheeled south, and the rest of France lay almost defenseless before them. In early June, the Germans launched a second offensive, code-named Fall Rot or Case Red, against the remaining French line. The French fought bravely, but they were outmaneuvered, outnumbered in the air, and running low on everything. By the 14th of June, German troops entered Paris, which the French government had already declared an open city. An open city meant the French chose not to defend the capital street by street, sparing it from destruction. Just over a week later, on the 22nd of June, France signed an armistice with Germany in the same railway car used in 1918. Hitler chose that exact location deliberately to humiliate France by reversing the humiliation Germany had suffered there in 1918. The campaign had lasted just 6 weeks, and the fall of France stands as one of the swiftest collapses of a major power in modern history. Yet even as Paris fell, the Maginot Line forts in the east had still never fired a shot in anger against the main German force. The men inside those forts had trained for years to fight, and instead they waited in perfect, useless readiness. When the armistice was signed, those same garrisons were ordered to surrender their impregnable forts without a fight. German forces took control of the line largely intact, capturing weapons, ammunition, and machinery worth a fortune. In a bitter irony, the Germans later reused parts of the Maginot Line as their own defensive positions against the Allies. During the Allied liberation of France in 1944, American troops had to fight through those same concrete works. So the line that France built to prevent a German invasion ended up fighting on the wrong side of history twice over. But the deeper question is whether the Maginot Line was a foolish blunder or a rational decision that simply failed. On paper, the line was a sound investment because it bought France time to mobilize its reserve army in safety. Its garrisons were meant to be a shield, not a sword, holding the frontier while the main army struck elsewhere. The flaw was not the wall itself, but the strategy that treated the Ardennes forest as an unbreachable moat. French intelligence had actually detected the German armor massing in the Ardennes days before the attack began. But the High Command dismissed the reports, convinced the terrain made a mass tank attack impossible. That single assumption, repeated so often it became doctrine, is what handed the Germans their decisive advantage. The Maginot Line was not a military failure in engineering terms. It was a failure of imagination and doctrine. France built the perfect defense for the last war, and in doing so, left its flank wide open for the next one. But before we judge the French generals too harshly, we must weigh what the line actually cost them to build. By the time construction wound down in the mid-1930s, France had sunk enormous sums into the concrete. Historians estimate the total outlay at well over 3 billion francs, a staggering share of the national budget. That money bought roughly 150 kilometers of continuous fortification along the German frontier. Yet the line was never continuous because it stopped exactly where the Ardennes forest began. The fortified sector simply ended at the forest edge because the generals considered the woods a natural barrier. Beyond the Ardennes, the line continued in lighter form to the coast, but it was a skeleton of the eastern works. So the doctrine itself acknowledged the Ardennes as the weak flank, yet did almost nothing to fortify it. Instead, the French relied on demolishing the few roads and bridges that crossed that rugged terrain. The theory held that any German army entering the forest would be slowed to a crawl by the broken ground. What the French failed to grasp was that the German army had studied those same roads for years. German engineers had quietly mapped every track, every ford, and every usable crossing in the region. They even built full-scale replicas of French bridges back in Germany to practice crossing them under fire. When the offensive finally came, the Germans moved entire armored divisions through that supposedly impassable forest. The traffic jams were real and terrifying, but the Germans had rehearsed them and pushed through anyway. In roughly one day, the leading German armor emerged from the Ardennes onto the open plains of northern France. That breakthrough in the Ardennes did not happen in isolation. It was the hinge of a much larger German plan. The German offensive was codenamed Fall Gelb or Case Yellow, and it was built entirely around that one gamble. The plan had actually been drafted by General Erich von Manstein, who argued for the main thrust through the Ardennes. Hitler had initially favored a simpler repeat of the old Schlieffen plan through the Low Countries. But a forced landing by a German aircraft in Belgium gave the Allies the original plan in January 1940. A German officer had been carrying the invasion plans on him when his plane went down over Belgium. When the Allies recovered those documents, they believed the original plan and moved their best armies north. That reaction was exactly what Manstein hoped for, so the Germans quietly rewrote the plan around the Ardennes. The revised case yellow made the Low Countries a feint, and the Ardennes the true point of decision. On the 10th of May 1940, German forces struck the Netherlands and Belgium to draw the Allies in. Believing this was the main attack, the Allied High Command sent its best divisions rushing northward. Meanwhile, the true German spearhead had already begun threading its way through the Ardennes forest. The German armored mass stretched for miles in the forest, one long traffic jam protected only by secrecy. The French had placed only light screening forces in the Ardennes, far too few to stop such a column. By the 13th of May, the leading German panzer divisions had reached the Meuse River at Sedan. Sedan held a special meaning for France, for it was there that the army had last been humiliated in 1870. The Meuse crossing at Sedan on the 13th of May became the decisive turning point of the entire campaign. What made Sedan so dangerous was that the river bend there offered a natural corridor straight toward Paris. But the French defenders on the far bank were not the elite troops the generals had promised. The sector was held largely by reserve divisions with limited training and older equipment. Against them, the Germans massed 1,000 aircraft and the full weight of 3 Panzer Corps. One of the war's greatest air bombardments fell on those French positions in a matter of hours. The French artillery was silenced, and the surviving defenders were left isolated and stunned. By the evening of that same day, German infantry had forced a crossing in inflatable boats. Engineers then threw pontoon bridges across the Meuse within the same night, a remarkable feat of field engineering. By the next day, tanks were rolling across the river in numbers the French could not contest. Once across, the panzer divisions fanned out behind the French line and headed for the Channel coast. Their objective was to cut off the Allied armies that had marched north into Belgium. This was a classic encirclement, and the speed of it left the Allied High Command reeling. The French had prepared for a slow, grinding war, not a lightning dash through their own rear areas. Within days, the panzers reached the English Channel, splitting the Allied armies in two. The northern Allied forces, including the British Expeditionary Force, were now trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved more than 300,000 men, but it also ended any hope of holding the line. While the world watched Dunkirk, the rest of the German army turned south to finish the campaign. The French armies that remained were still strong on paper, but they had lost their best units in the north. The panzer divisions that had crossed the Meuse now wheeled south toward the heart of France. And now, at last, the question of the Maginot Line itself could no longer be postponed. The fortresses of the line had never been breached, and now the enemy was approaching them from behind. The line had been built to face east toward Germany, with its heaviest guns pointed the wrong way. French doctrine had never imagined a threat from the west, so the rear of the line was left lightly defended. In mid-June, German forces began to attack the line from the southwest, where it was weakest. The Germans used heavy artillery and special explosive charges to break through the smaller rear fortifications. Some of the great main forts held out and were never captured by direct assault at all. Their garrisons surrendered only on the 22nd of June, when the armistice was signed. The armistice was signed in the very same railway carriage used at the end of the First World War. Hitler chose that carriage deliberately to reverse the humiliation Germany had suffered in 1918. The campaign had lasted just 6 weeks, and France had fallen to an enemy it had built a wall to stop. Yet the story of the Maginot Line does not end with the armistice, for its forts would see war again. After the armistice, the Germans occupied the great forts rather than destroy them outright. They found the fortifications largely intact, with their turrets, power plants, and rail systems still in working order. In 1944, as the Allies advanced from the west, the Germans prepared to use the line as their own defensive barrier. The enemy they had built the wall to stop now sat inside it, pointing those guns back at the men who had designed them. American and French forces reached the region in late 1944, and the fighting for the old forts began again. The line had been designed to stop a German invasion from the east, and now it proved just as stubborn from the west. The American Third Army, under General George Patton, spent weeks reducing the forts one by one in the autumn of 1944. These battles were slow and costly because the forts had been built to endure exactly this kind of siege. Some of the strongest forts held out until the Germans finally surrendered them in March of 1945. So the Maginot Line was never breached by frontal assault in 1940, yet it still failed completely. That paradox is the real lesson of the line, and it has haunted military planners ever since. The line was not a failure of engineering, it was a failure of imagination about how the next war would actually be fought. Every great defense must answer the question of what happens when the enemy declines to attack it where you are strongest. France had built the most sophisticated defensive system in human history, and the answer was simply to go around it. Yet the line was not entirely pointless, for it held a substantial German army in place while the panzers struck elsewhere. But tying down troops was never the purpose for which France had spent a decade and $1 billion. So what did the Maginot Line actually achieve, and why does its story still matter to planners today? The first honest answer is that the line did delay the enemy, though not in the way its builders intended. German records show that the line held at least 8 German divisions along the Rhine for the entire campaign. Those divisions were the reserve that might otherwise have reinforced the panzer thrust through the Ardennes. So in purely operational terms, the line was not worthless, and historians now give it more credit than it once received. But the deeper problem was that the line shaped French strategy far beyond its own concrete and steel. Because the generals trusted the wall, they built a mobile army that was too slow and too small to fight a war of movement. The French built more tanks than the Germans in 1940, but spread them thinly across the whole front. The Germans concentrated their armor into a single hammer blow, which is exactly how they won in 6 weeks. So the line's greatest cost was not its price tag, but the false confidence it gave to a whole generation of commanders. That confidence discouraged the mobile, offensive thinking that France would have needed to meet the German strategy. One French general, Charles de Gaulle, had argued for fast armored divisions years before the war, but his ideas were ignored. His writings on armored warfare were published in the 1930s, years before the Germans applied the same ideas. The German panzer commanders had read de Gaulle's work and learned from it, even as France rejected it. So the Maginot Line stands as a warning that even perfect engineering cannot save a flawed doctrine. And its lesson endures, because every military today still asks the same question the French answered wrong in 1940. That question is whether the next war will be fought where your defenses are, or somewhere you never thought to look. The Maginot Line also shaped the very map of the campaign, because it forced the German plan in a specific direction. German planning documents show the line was treated as an obstacle to be avoided, not a barrier to be broken. So in a strange way, the line did protect the Franco-German border, while leaving every other border exposed. The Belgian border and the northern plain were protected only by the promise that Belgium would fight alongside France. That promise collapsed in May of 1940 when the Germans struck through the Low Countries and Belgium. The French and British forces raced north to meet them, walking straight into the German trap. While they were committed in Belgium, the panzer divisions burst through the Ardennes behind their flank. This was the famous sickle cut, a single armored thrust that reached the English Channel in 10 days. That drive split the Allied armies in two and trapped the British Expeditionary Force against the sea at Dunkirk. The evacuation of Dunkirk saved more than 300,000 men, but it did not save the campaign. With the northern armies gone, the Germans turned south, and the rest of France fell within 3 more weeks. France signed an armistice on the 22nd of June, 1940, just 6 weeks after the offensive began. The Maginot Line forts, never breached by assault, were simply abandoned and handed over under the terms of the armistice. So the most expensive fortification ever built changed hands without a single decisive battle inside its walls. That single fact captures the entire tragedy of the line, and it is the reason its story is still studied today. After the armistice, the German army occupied the line and used its own fortifications against its builders. The Germans even turned some of the captured casemates into ammunition stores for the Atlantic Wall. But the line's real legacy was not its concrete, but the questions it forced every later army to ask. One of those questions was whether a fixed defense can ever keep pace with fast-moving armies. The answer the French gave in 1940 was shaped by the slow artillery of the last war. But the Germans had learned a different lesson, and they built a doctrine around speed and surprise. So the same war gave two neighbors two opposite conclusions about how the next one would be fought. That contrast is why the Maginot Line remains a case study in every military academy today. And its lessons have echoed through later conflicts, from the Cold War to the present day. During the Cold War, NATO faced the same question of how to defend a long border against a fast-moving enemy. Planners studied the Ardennes operation carefully because it showed how a defensive line could be outflanked. And the same forest saw another German offensive in 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge. So the geography that doomed the Maginot Line kept shaping campaigns long after the fortress was abandoned. But the deeper lesson of the line is about the danger of preparing to fight the last war. Every generation builds its own Maginot Line in the weapons and assumptions it trusts most. The question is whether we will be wise enough to see the forest that the enemy will drive through instead. One such lesson emerged in the early Cold War, as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization rebuilt Europe's defenses behind a new dividing line. The Iron Curtain was not a wall of concrete, but it posed the same question of how to hold a front against a massed armored thrust. And the planners who answered it remembered the Ardennes because they had studied exactly how the Germans had turned the Maginot Line. So NATO built a layered defense in depth, deliberately avoiding the single fixed line that had failed France in 1940. Yet the deeper irony is that the Maginot Line's true value may have been misunderstood for decades. Some modern historians argue the line actually worked as intended because it forced the Germans onto the ground France could least defend. In other words, the line did exactly what it was built to do, channeling the enemy into a corridor of France's choosing. But the corridor it chose led through the Ardennes, where the French had set no comparable defenses. So the line was not a strategic mistake in itself, but the doctrine behind it proved fatal when the enemy chose a different route. The lesson was not that fortresses are useless, but that no wall can substitute for a flexible and mobile strategy. That is why the line still appears in modern doctrine discussions, from armored warfare to cyber defense and border security. Every fixed defense, whether concrete or digital, faces the same fundamental problem of where to draw the line. And the answer, as 1940 showed, depends on understanding not just where the enemy might come, but how fast they can move. The Maginot Line was designed for the tempo of 1914, when armies advanced at the speed of marching men. But it was outrun by the tempo of 1940, when panzer divisions covered in days what infantry once took weeks to cross. So the fortress that cost $1 billion was defeated not by firepower, but by the simple arithmetic of time and distance. Yet the story does not end in 1940, because the line's ghosts kept reappearing in later European wars. In the 1950s, France rebuilt a new defense line along the Rhine, this time against a different enemy. It was called the Meuse Line, named for the Moselle River, though it was never built to the Maginot scale. But the most striking echo of the Maginot idea appeared across the world, in the demilitarized zone that split Korea. The Korean demilitarized zone has held since 1953, one of the most heavily fortified borders ever built. Here the fixed line worked, because the enemy's geography and the terrain left no easy way around it. So the lesson of the Maginot Line was never that walls cannot work, but that they only work where the flanks are closed. The Ardennes forest, which the French called impassable, was the open flank that turned $1 billion investment into a museum piece. Today, the forts survive as a network of museums, drawing visitors who walk the same galleries the garrisons once manned. One of the largest, the Schonenberg Fort, still shows its underground railway and its rotating artillery turrets. Visitors descend into the tunnels and see the hospital, the power plant, and the barracks that made each fort a self-contained city. The engineering that built these works remains a genuine marvel, even if the strategy that placed them was flawed. So the Maginot Line is not simply a story of failure, but a study in how brilliance and blindness can share one design. Every nation that builds a defensive line must ask the same question France failed to answer in 1940. That question is simple to ask and brutal to answer. Where will the enemy go when they refuse to fight where you want them to? The answer France learned in 1940 was that a wall is only as strong as the thinking that stands behind it. And yet the most overlooked chapter of the Maginot Line is what happened after the armistice, when the Germans took the forts for themselves. From 1940 until the Allied landings in Normandy, the Germans garrisoned the captured fortifications and even used some as command posts and storage depots. Then, in the winter of 1944, the Americans reached the line from the west and found the positions still defended by German troops. So the line that had been built to stop the Germans was now fought over by Americans and Germans in a battle the French had never planned for. One of the most dramatic of these clashes was the fight for Fort Hackenberg, the largest fort on the whole line. The garrison inside held out against the American assault for nearly a week, fighting from the very galleries built to protect France. When the Americans finally took Hackenberg, they discovered the fortress had survived the entire war almost undamaged by direct assault. The point was proven again in 1944 that the concrete itself was nearly invulnerable to anything the attackers could bring to bear. And so the fortifications proved their worth in combat at last, but for the wrong side and against the wrong enemy. This strange afterlife of the Maginot Line continued well after the war ended in 1945. During the Cold War, many forts were stripped of their guns and machinery, their metal recycled, and their galleries left to the damp. But a handful of forts were saved by local volunteers, who began restoring the tunnels and the turrets in the 1970s. Their work turned the abandoned fortresses into living museums, where the original generators and railways still run today. Visitors ride the underground railway, watch the turrets rise and fire, and hear the story of the men who once lived below the earth. These museums preserve not just the machinery, but the memory of the 200,000 men who once served on the line. And in that quiet preservation, the line finally fulfilled the role its builders intended, as a guardian of French memory and history. Yet the story of the Maginot Line does not end with the museums, for the doctrine itself outlived the concrete. The same belief in fixed fortifications shaped other border projects across the 20th century. The Germans themselves studied the Maginot Line closely, and its lessons shaped their own West Wall defenses. The West Wall, also called the Siegfried Line, ran opposite the Maginot along Germany's western border. Built in the late 1930s, the West Wall was meant to shield the Rhineland from a French attack. It proved just as vulnerable to the same flaw, for a line is only as good as the terrain that anchors it. When the Allies finally assaulted the Siegfried Line in 1944, they found it patchy and under-garrisoned. So the fixed-line doctrine failed on both sides of the Rhine, for the same reason it always fails. Yet the deeper lesson is more subtle, and it concerns time, technology, and the pace of modern war. The Maginot Line was designed for the tempo of 1914, when armies moved at the speed of a march. But by 1940, the tank and the dive bomber had compressed the battlefield into days, not years. A fortress built to hold a front for years was asked to hold it for weeks, and the arithmetic no longer worked. The same mismatch of tempo would haunt fixed defenses in every war that followed, from the Cold War to today. And yet the line still holds a final secret, one hidden in the ground beneath the forts themselves. Beneath the Schonenberg and other forts run deep galleries that still hold the machinery and the silence of 1940. And in one of those deep chambers, historians found something the builders never intended anyone to see. In that deep chamber beneath Fort Schonenberg, engineers discovered a hidden elevator shaft that had been sealed off and forgotten. The shaft descended far below the main galleries, into a level that appeared on no surviving blueprint of the fort. What they found there was not a weapon, but a record, a cache of documents and personal effects left behind in 1940. Among the papers were garrison rosters, duty logs, and the letters of men who had expected to hold this fort for years. The letters spoke of the routine below ground, of meals, of watch rotations, and of the long waiting that defined fortress life. And in one letter, a soldier wrote his family that the line could never fall, because no army could break such steel and stone. That soldier was right about the steel and stone and wrong about the war, and both truths define the whole tragedy of the line. The fortifications were never breached by force of arms, and yet the nation they defended fell in 6 weeks. And so the deepest lesson of the Maginot Line is not about concrete, but about the danger of preparing for the last war. Every army builds its defenses for the enemy it remembers, and that enemy is always a generation out of date. The French had studied the lessons of 1914 with perfect fidelity, and that fidelity was itself the fatal error. The Germans, by contrast, built a doctrine around movement, around the tank and the aircraft working as one weapon. The collision of a doctrine of immobility against a doctrine of speed produced the shortest great power campaign in history. France fell in 40 days, a collapse that stunned the world and ended the pre-war order in a single summer. And the Maginot Line, the most expensive construction project in French history, watched it all from behind its invincible walls. Its guns never fired at the enemy that mattered, and its galleries never saw the battle that decided the fate of France. Today the line still stands, a chain of silent forts stretching across the French countryside. Many of its forts have been preserved as museums, open to the public who walk its galleries today. The Schonenberg Fort alone draws thousands of visitors each year to see its underground world. And in the visitor center, the letters of the garrison are displayed behind glass for all to read. The soldier who wrote that the line could never fall is now part of the story he could not foresee. His faith in steel and stone was not foolish, for it was a faith shared by an entire nation. The tragedy of the Maginot Line is that it was built by brilliant men who were perfectly wrong. Every generation of soldiers must ask itself what war will look like in the years ahead, not behind. The walls we build to keep out the last enemy are often the very thing that blinds us to the next one. And that is the enduring lesson of the Maginot Line, a billion-dollar monument to a war that never came. If this story changed how you see the Maginot Line, subscribe and ring the bell for more forgotten fronts of history.